Welcome to the Cheating Wife Stories channel. I sat waiting in my lawyer's conference room, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu. The paintings on the walls, the furniture, even the old National Geographic magazine on the end table, it was all the same as it had been 5 years ago. Despite the considerable fees I had paid him over the years, it seemed he hadn't splurged on updating the decor. Fortunately, this visit wasn't costing me much as I was alone in the room. So why was I in a lawyer's office if I wasn't actually going to use one? The answer was simple: Stella Jefferson, my ex-wife. For the past couple of weeks, she had been trying to reach me without success. The reason for her lack of success was her penchant for introducing me to the justice system, divorce style. I had learned the hard way that any unauthorized contact with Stella would lead to police involvement and court appearances. I became a firm believer in this process when she lured me to meet her while the divorce was still pending to discuss custody issues. We were supposed to meet at a restaurant where we had dined years earlier, where I had proposed to her against all logic. I hoped this was a sign of reconciliation, despite the pain and humiliation she had caused me. I had dressed up in a sport jacket and tie for the upscale restaurant and eagerly looked for her in the crowd. Eventually, I spotted her at a corner table, looking out the window. Maybe she was waiting for me. I pointed her out to the hostess and made my way to her table. She was still stunning, a tall brunette in a little black dress, exuding elegance. But as I approached, her expression shifted from warmth to cold animosity, which puzzled me. Before I could say anything, 2 uniformed police officers approached our table. They asked if I was John Perry and informed me that I was under arrest for violating a temporary restraining order issued by the judge overseeing our divorce case. Despite my protests that she had called me to meet her, they told me I could take that up with the judge. The court order was clear: no contact with her without permission. She had claimed that I was a threat to her and the children, and the court had taken her allegations seriously. I was stunned when I first read the divorce pleading she had filed. She had beaten me to the punch and had taken a no-holds-barred approach. The lies in the documents made it clear the court saw me as a risk, and only the judge would decide when, if ever, I could see my family again. The embarrassment of being arrested was overwhelming. As I was physically subdued and handcuffed, I saw a young child at an adjoining table recoiling in fear. I wanted to explain that I wasn't a bad person, but how do you start that conversation in a moment like this? Before I could even begin, I was manhandled out of the restaurant and into the back of a police cruiser. During the drive to the municipal jail, I protested my innocence to the officers, but they ignored me, likely used to such claims. Once at the jail, I was booked and processed. My fingerprints were taken, and I had my mugshot done. I was asked for my personal details, which I provided, expecting a chance to explain the situation. Instead, I was led to a holding cell with about 50 other men. As I was about to enter the cell, I asked about making a phone call and arranging bail. The police sergeant explained that each morning, a phone is brought around for inmates to make local calls. If you need to make a long-distance call, the recipient must accept the charges. As for bail, since I was charged with contempt of the judge's order, I would need to appear before the judge before any release could be considered. And since today was Friday, I wouldn't be scheduled to appear until Monday at the earliest. With that, he firmly pushed me into the cell. The clang of the cell door and the latch of the key echoed against the cold, dank concrete walls. Without making eye contact, I found a spot against the wall, sat on the floor, and tried to settle in for the next 3 days. The environment was challenging to describe. There were individuals from every walk of life: hardened criminals, gang members, college students, drunks, addicts, and the occasional person like me. The constant ebb and flow of people arriving and leaving created a noisy, disruptive atmosphere. There was an unspoken pecking order for everything, from using the phone to meals, even to receiving a blanket. Those with antisocial tendencies often targeted the more vulnerable, leading to fights that required police intervention and medical treatment for the victims. Throughout the weekend, my appearance drew some attention. It seemed that if I could afford to dress well, people assumed I should be able to afford bail. Despite my frustration, it seemed the other inmates considered me too much trouble and chose easier targets. Monday morning arrived, and we were all roused and ankle-chained together. We shuffled outside to a bus, where we were unchained and seated, then restrained with additional shackles. After a head count, we were driven to the courthouse, where we were once again ankle-chained and escorted into a basement holding cell to await our turn before the judge. Finally, around 2 p.m., my name was called, and I appeared before the judge in disheveled clothes, smelling of the jail cell and sporting a 3-day beard. Stella was present, her expression triumphant as her attorney recounted the events of Friday night from her perspective. Your Honor, my client was minding her own business dining out when she was traumatized by the sudden appearance of her husband. The police intervened before any harm could come to her, the attorney said with righteous indignation. To my surprise, my lawyer had arrived, despite my failure to contact him. The judge's clerk had called him earlier that morning, and he was able to represent me. I tried to quickly explain to my lawyer what had happened, and he was simultaneously relaying my account to the judge. After some back and forth, the judge turned to me and asked, "Mr. Perry, do you understand that when I issue a restraining order and a no-contact order, I expect you to follow them?" I started to protest, but my attorney firmly squeezed my arm and whispered for me to remain silent. The judge continued his remarks for a few more minutes before ordering my release and reiterating the warning not to contact Stella. As the court session ended, I watched Stella rise from her seat and leave the courtroom, accompanied by her attorney, both wearing triumphant expressions. My lawyer spent a few minutes giving me hurried advice as the bailiff handcuffed me to escort me back to the basement holding cell. Then it was a matter of waiting until all the other individuals had been through court before we were driven back to jail. Once there, I was processed and given my personal belongings along with paperwork indicating where my truck had been towed and how to arrange for its release. With a sigh, I left the building and called the towing service to arrange for my truck's retrieval. Afterward, I called a cab and waited. I tried to reach my boss, but the call went to voicemail since it was past 5 p.m. I decided I would explain everything in person the next day. Hoping for a quiet ride to the tow yard, I ended up with a particularly chatty cab driver who kept asking questions. I responded with brief answers, but he continued talking. Eventually, I told him I would start deducting his tip for every word he spoke. That finally got him to stop, and we finished the drive in relative peace. I did feel guilty for snapping at him and ended up leaving a generous tip. Retrieving my vehicle was another bureaucratic challenge. The paperwork and procedures were far more complicated than I had anticipated. Finally, I managed to get my truck and drove home, a small camper trailer with a bedroom, bathroom, kitchenette, electricity, and running water. Once home, I stripped off my clothes and debated whether to discard them, but decided against it to save money. I hoped the dry cleaners could remove the smell and the stain on my pride. After a hot shower, which quickly turned cold as the water heater ran out, I dried off and collapsed into bed. It had been a grueling weekend. The next morning, I made and enjoyed a large breakfast of eggs and bacon, feeling I deserved a treat after everything. I arrived at work early, only to face a public reprimand from my boss. "I don't know who you think you are, but I'm not going to tolerate your absence and lack of commitment," he scolded. The accusation stung, especially since I had never missed a day of work in 10 years except for scheduled vacations. My boss continued to rant, drawing a crowd of curious colleagues. His anger seemed to grow as he addressed me publicly, and I tried to stall and asked to speak privately. But he was intent on making an example of me. In the heat of the moment, I finally snapped. I was in jail. My Dan wife had me put in jail. "Are you happy now?" I shouted. The shock on his face mirrored that of my coworkers. I had never imagined I would end up in such a situation. The emotional release continued as I expressed the resentment I had been holding in. "Thank you for making it all public, you sorry son of a bitch. I remember propping you up during your divorce, and this is how you repay me. Screw you and the horse you rode in on. I quit." With that, I turned and walked back to the parking lot to get into my truck. Several coworkers followed, trying to persuade me to stay and discuss things with my boss privately, but I was resolute. For 10 long years, I had worked hard, feeling unappreciated and underpaid. Now I was living alone and uncertain about when I would see my children again. As I drove off, my phone pinged with a new text message. I decided not to dig my phone out of my pocket to see who had texted me. I suspected it was my boss wanting to make amends. With nowhere else to go, and it being too early for the bars to be open, I returned to my camper. I pulled into the dirt driveway, carefully avoiding the larger potholes, and turned off the truck. Then, I pulled out the phone and opened the text. I was flabbergasted to see it was from Stella. It read, "John, I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding." Before I could even think, I texted back, "Stella, what were you trying to prove?" I waited for a reply, but none came. A couple of hours later, I received a call from my friend Jerry from work. I was sure he would try to convince me to come back and ask for my job, but instead, he told me the police were looking for me. I thanked him for the information and hung up. Once again, I had fallen prey to a weak moment, and Stella had taken advantage of it. I knew the police would soon be at my new location, since I had provided it for their records when I was jailed. I could expect another stay in jail, courtesy of Stella. I quickly assessed the situation and made a decision. I unhooked the electrical and water connections to the camper and backed up the truck to hitch up the trailer. It was unfortunate that I would lose my security deposit at the trailer park, but I needed to buy some time. As I drove out of the park with all my possessions, I decided to use my phone while driving. First, I called my lawyer. After finally reaching him, I explained what had happened. He called me a dumbass and then proceeded to chew me out. He said he would contact the court to try to get a hearing set so I could surrender there rather than be arrested again. He warned me not to have any further contact with Stella, and I assured him I had learned my lesson. Next, I called the manager of the trailer park to cancel my lease. Then I called my grandparents and drove nearly 100 miles east to their home. There, I hoped to find sanctuary. When I arrived, they came out to greet me, both looking concerned. They knew the initial extent of my troubles, but updating them would only cause them more worry. Grandma insisted on feeding me before we talked. As we ate some of her fried chicken, I explained the dramatic events of the weekend. They were appalled at how toxic my relationship with Stella had become. I then asked them for a big favor. Would it be okay if I camp out here for a while until things settle down? My grandfather looked at me and said, "John, you know this will always be your home. Just set up your camper where you want." That solved one problem. Although I didn't have any income coming in, I could delay paying rent until I was in a position to start repaying my grandparents. I asked if they knew of any local construction companies hiring. They considered the question and suggested a few possibilities, but it seemed no one was hiring at the moment. This was troubling as I still had outstanding debts and responsibilities, including paying my unpredictable attorney, whose attitude seemed to change with the ebb and flow of the retainer. I then asked if they knew anyone who needed handyman work. They brightened at this question and provided a few names and addresses for me to check out. They also promised to call their circle of friends to find more prospects. The rest of the day was spent setting up electrical and water service to the camper. My grandparents offered me the use of their house, but I didn't want to crowd them. I believed in Ben Franklin's adage that fish and guests stink after 3 days. Over the next couple of days, I visited all the local construction companies looking for work. Sure enough, no one was hiring, but I managed to fill out many job application forms. I cringed at the thought of anyone contacting my former employer. On the bright side, my attorney had managed to get a hearing date set for my second contempt hearing regarding the no-contact order. All I had to do was avoid getting picked up by the police before the hearing date. Meanwhile, I landed my first job as a handyman. A neighbor of my grandparents wanted to demolish an old barn. My bid was half of what others had offered, and it included hauling off all the debris. All the other estimates had assumed it would be a 2 to 3 day job using a crew of employees. However, I finished in just one long day. As I was loading the last of the debris into my grandpa's flapped trailer, the neighbor, Mr. Lambert, came out with 2 ice-cold bottles of beer. I gratefully accepted the offering, and we watched the remnants of the sunset fade into twilight as we silently sipped our drinks. "Well, John, at first I wasn't sure you'd be able to get the job done in one day, but you did. And you didn't use any heavy machinery," Mr. Lambert said. "That's why everyone else's bids were so high, they figured in renting equipment." "Well, Mr. Lambert, my Dodge pickup thinks it's a bulldozer," I explained. I detailed how I used heavy chains on the support beams, and the torque of my pickup in low gear did the rest. The barn collapsed like a deck of cards, and the rest was just a matter of using heavy work gloves and a strong back to lug the old timbers into the trailer. I got scratched up by a couple of rusty nails, so I'll need to get a tetanus shot tomorrow, but for now, this is all the medicine I need. I finished the last sip of beer and tossed the empty bottle into the bed of my pickup. It was good manners to keep Mr. Lambert company while he finished, so we engaged in small talk. He insisted I call him Robert. After shaking hands, I left his property, slowly hauling the trailer back to my grandparents' place. Tomorrow morning, I would dump the debris at the local landfill before going in for my shot. The next day, I unloaded the trailer at the landfill and got my tetanus shot. Then, I drove to another neighbor's place, where I spent the day cutting down deadwood trees using a chainsaw. I was assured that next week they would rent a log splitter, and we could discuss the price for removing all the stumps. Exhausted, I finally returned to my trailer. True to form, there was no rest for the wicked. I had court scheduled for the next day. Dressed in presentable clothes, I was surprised when my grandparents insisted on escorting me back to the city in a show of solidarity. They certainly got their money's worth as the court battle unfolded. Once again, I was threatened with jail if I continued contacting Stella. Despite my assurances that I had learned my lesson, the court set a hearing date for child visitation, custody, property settlement, and the divorce. The admonishment not to cause trouble seemed to go unnoticed by my grandmother, who confronted Stella after we left the court. "Stella Perry, you ought to be ashamed of yourself for what you've done. It was bad enough you cheated on John, but now you're trying to get him locked up. And why did you lie about him hurting you and the kids? You know well he loves you and the children with all his heart and would never harm any of you. It's a crime and a sin to keep John away from his children." To her credit, Stella blushed with embarrassment as my determined grandmother went face to face with her. Stella and her companion, Ted Jefferson, waited uncomfortably for the elevator to the lobby, trying to escape my grandmother's verbal barrage. As the confrontation grew more uncomfortable, Stella and Ted eventually retreated down the stairs to make their getaway. The crowd gathered gave my grandmother a small round of applause for the entertainment value. As we entered the elevator, I reviewed the court dates prescribed by the judge. Of the 3 hearings, the only priority for me was seeing my children. Due to Stella's allegations, the state's Child Protection Office had become involved. Now, I had to worry about a misguided social worker having the power to keep my children away from me. I was only allowed periodic visits, under the supervision of a social worker, with my 8-year-old daughter, Carol, and my 10-year-old son, Stephen, at a neutral site until the matter was resolved. The joy I felt seeing my children run towards me during each visit was only matched by the anguish I felt as they were tearfully led away by the social worker, crying, "Daddy, Daddy." After they left, I would blindly stagger to my truck and spend the next few hours sobbing uncontrollably in the cab. How could Stella have done this to us? I reflected on how blessed I had been to marry her. She had been the love and light of my life for over 10 years, and together we had brought the greatest children into the world. While we weren't rich, we weren't exactly poor either. Both of us had jobs and the usual challenges of maintaining a budget, but overall, I was content with life. However, there was a troubling issue at hand. Ted Jefferson, a successful businessman, had somehow become interested in Stella and was persistently pursuing her. I didn't realize how long this had been going on. All I noticed was a gradual cooling in the love and affection between Stella and me. At first, I was perplexed by her increasing reluctance to be intimate. When we first married, we had plans for 3 children, but whenever I brought up the subject, it was met with excuses. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up and chose to focus on our 2 wonderful children. I was content with this as we began engaging in various activities like football, baseball, soccer, piano, ballet, and swimming, whatever captured their interest. I believed that participating in a range of activities would help them become well-rounded, and as they grew older, they could focus on the ones they truly enjoyed. Stella and I created a calendar to manage all their appointments. Over time, I noticed that I was becoming the primary chauffeur, while Stella increasingly avoided these responsibilities due to frequent business meetings. Whenever I voiced my concerns, she would accuse me of wanting to keep her in a traditional role. I learned to keep my frustrations to myself as we navigated these challenging times in our marriage. Even the small moments of intimacy we once shared, like talking quietly in bed, began to vanish. Instead, Stella developed a new habit of reading in bed, and any attempts to connect physically were met with resistance. I missed those quiet, cherished conversations just as much as the physical closeness. On another front, Stella started to complain about our financial situation, claiming that we were struggling and that she and the children were doing without. I was baffled by these accusations and asked her to specify what was missing from our lives. 6 months later, I discovered the answer. Ted Jefferson. I had noticed all the signs of an affair, but loved and trusted Stella so much that I chose to ignore them. Then came a Saturday morning that would change everything. Carol and Stephen had soccer practice, and I was on the bleachers cheering them on. A woman sat next to me, Donna Richards, our preacher's wife. We chatted about our kids and the weather, and she mentioned a weather front bringing rain for the weekend. I was dismayed to hear this news, as I had been putting off mowing the lawn and now faced a likely rainy weekend. Donna kindly offered to take the kids with her to get a meal after practice and drop them off at the house. I insisted on paying for their meal and gratefully accepted her offer. As I arrived home, I noticed a late-model Cadillac in our driveway and assumed it was one of Stella's friends. I parked on the street, went into the carport, and began mowing the lawn. I had just completed a few passes when a stranger emerged from the house, ignored me, and got into the Cadillac. His shirt was untucked on one side, and he fumbled with the car keys before speeding off down the street. Ignoring my calls, I turned off the mower and rushed inside. Stella wasn't downstairs, so I hurried upstairs, calling her name. Reaching our bedroom, I saw the bathroom door open and noticed something on the floor, a pair of Stella's panties. The bed was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and her hair was a mess. I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by a wave of realization. In my shock, I missed Stella slipping out of the room. When I finally gathered myself, it was noon, and she was gone. The lawnmower had stopped, out of gas, and Donna hadn't arrived with the kids yet. Torn between searching for Stella and waiting for the kids, I decided to prioritize them. When they arrived and asked about their mom, I had no answers. Stella's phone went straight to voicemail. The house felt heavy with uncertainty, and the kids could sense it. They eventually came to terms with my lack of answers. I managed to get them ready for school on Monday, but the uncertainty weighed heavily on me. Work was challenging as my thoughts kept drifting to Stella. At lunch, I joined my coworkers but couldn't eat. The afternoon dragged on, and as I left the construction site, a man approached with a thick envelope informing me that I was being served. I opened it to find legal documents mentioning terms like divorce, alimony, and restraining order. I reached out to a friend who had been through a similar situation, and he put me in touch with his attorney cousin. Meeting him after hours, I faced the reality of the legal fees and the speed at which Stella and her lawyer had acted. In the attorney's office, he reviewed the paperwork and delivered the grim news. "John, I've been practicing law for 10 years, and this is one of the most challenging cases I've seen. Your wife's chosen a firm known for aggressive tactics. They filed and served you right after you discovered her infidelity. They've already secured a restraining order against you, claiming physical and emotional abuse." The judge acted swiftly, given the allegations of her fearing for her safety. The attorney continued reading through the paperwork, detailing the restraining order and other legal requests. "Your wife has claimed that you were mentally cruel to her and the kids throughout the marriage. She fears for her safety, so here's the no-contact order you must adhere to unless the court lifts it. This restraining order keeps you at least 500 yards away from her, your children, and your home. You're also prohibited from contacting them by any electronic means, writing, or through third parties." You waved the paperwork slightly, highlighting the gravity of the situation. "There are requests for supervised visits with the children, limited to 1 hour at a neutral location. Stella is also asking for sole custody in the house and for alimony that exceeds the state's guidelines due to the unusual circumstances of the case. Additionally, she's requesting all assets from the marital estate and psychological evaluations for the children, all at your expense." The attorney sighed. "She's very upset with you. I understand you want to see your kids and fight this, but the issue is affordability. They'll bury you in paperwork and legal fees and stall on every issue until you've exhausted all your resources or give up. It took several hearings just to get the court to return my clothes and personal effects, and even then, her lawyers demanded additional time to review my property list. The hardest part was the court agreeing to limited supervised visitations until the case was finalized. I had initially planned to rent an apartment to weather the divorce, but the cost was prohibitive. A friend at work offered me an old trailer for $3,000, and I moved into the cheapest trailer park I could find. Despite these efforts, the legal fees continued to rise. Stella's proposal to meet seemed like a chance to resolve things, perhaps even reconcile, but it turned out to be more complex. I lost my job, moved away, and was living in a deteriorating trailer on my grandparents' property. The mounting legal costs added to my troubles. When the court finally adjudicated custody, considering my lack of stable employment and unsuitable living conditions, Stella was awarded sole custody of Carol and Stephen. Visitation was restricted to 1 hour of supervised time each month, starting on the second Saturday. Watching Stella celebrate with her legal team, I felt an overwhelming sense of despair. Despite the efforts of her experts, neither Stephen nor Carol said anything negative about me, yet the court's decision seemed to disregard their voices. As I left the courthouse, my footsteps echoed in the empty halls. The statue of justice, now a symbol of my disillusionment, stood as a stark reminder of the challenges ahead. The court's decision was clear. Stella would keep the marital home until Carol turned 18, at which point it would be sold and the proceeds divided. I was responsible for mortgage payments, child support, and alimony, though thankfully the latter was at the standard rate, and only for 5 years. I also had to manage all the debts accrued during the marriage. The asset division was so minimal that I was left with just my Dodge pickup truck and the trailer. It felt as though I was leaving town with my tail between my legs. On one hand, at least they'd have to spend money to come after me if I couldn't meet my obligations. On the other hand, I was determined to avoid that situation. I worked tirelessly, putting in 12 to 16-hour days, with no days off except the second Saturday of each month, which was marked in red on my calendar. When that day arrived, I drove to the designated location for the visit, arriving 2 hours early. I waited eagerly for Carol and Stephen, but as the scheduled time approached, the social worker arrived and took up her position in the room. The minutes ticked by, and after 15 minutes, she suggested that perhaps they weren't coming and that we should leave. I insisted they were just running late. 35 minutes into the hour, she suggested I call Stella to check the delay. I explained why this wasn't a viable option, but she called anyway. Stella's response was that they had miscalculated and were at the zoo in Dallas. She assured the social worker that such a mistake wouldn't happen again. As the social worker packed up her things to leave, I begged her to stay for the remaining 20 minutes. Her look conveyed pity as she walked out. I stayed behind, watching the clock, and when the hour was up, I gathered the small gifts I had brought and carried them back to my truck for the long, quiet drive home. The court's reaction was as expected. Stella received a reprimand, and then everyone went home. My request for an alternate visitation day was denied, as it was deemed too disruptive. The judge said he would overlook it this time, but warned it shouldn't happen again. I scrambled to keep up with payments for another month, and when the next Saturday arrived, I waited anxiously for Carol and Stephen. When they finally came running into the room, I fell to my knees as they hugged me. I cried tears of joy, savoring every moment. I asked them about their lives, learning that they had moved to a new house with Uncle Ted, who was buying them toys and taking them on outings. Stella seemed happy, and the kids spoke of their new life with enthusiasm. I forced a smile, though the news of Uncle Ted's gifts, iPads and iPods, made me feel inadequate. As the social worker announced there were only 5 minutes left, I held both children tightly, repeatedly telling them I loved them. After they left, I noticed Stephen had left his gift bag behind. I picked it up and saw Carol's bag discarded on a trash receptacle. I placed Stephen's bag on top of Carol's and went back to my truck. Month after month, I faced the same heartbreaking routine as my children grew more distant. I sensed an underlying resentment during visits. The visits became increasingly difficult, and eventually, Stephen asked if he and Carol could skip the next month's visit because Ted had tickets to a University of Texas Longhorns game. His request felt like a blow, but I agreed, stammering through my response. At the next visit, Stephen allowed me a reluctant hug before they left. It became more frequent for either Stephen or Carol, or both, to express their desire to be elsewhere rather than with me. Carol once told me, "It's not like you really are our daddy anymore." I should have been enraged. I should have been furious. I should have been over the top. Take no prisoners angry. But all I felt was numb. Do you feel that way, Stephen? Are you tired of me visiting? Stephen bowed his head and nodded yes. That just left one last question. Do you want to stop with the visits now? Both of my kids sunk their heads and nodded yes. I paused for a moment, and neither child would look me in the eyes. Okay, this will be the last visit. I'll keep driving up in case either of you change your mind, but I won't expect you to be here. I wish you only knew how much I love both of you, and how much I'm going to miss you, I quietly said for the first and only time. I left first, and wouldn't you know it, I bumped right into Stella outside, waiting to pick up the kids. I could tell she was panicking, with her court-ordered 500-yard buffer zone not meaning much to her in that instant. I just looked at her and said, "You won," then walked off. The wedding announcement was in all the local papers. My girl was a little bridesmaid, and my son served as Ted's best man. I contacted my lawyer for what I thought would be the last bit of representation and asked him to file for reconsideration of the alimony and request the sale of our marital home. Finally, the court sided with me and ended the alimony. Once we showed the marital home had become a rental property, the court ordered that I be awarded the difference upon the sale of the house. It was too little, too late. I went to my trailer and celebrated with a week-long drinking binge. I was nowhere near recovered when I heard a knock on my trailer door. As I opened the door, empty beer cans cascaded down around the feet of Robert Lambert, my grandparents' neighbor who had given me my first job raising his old barn. He looked at the sloppy mess I had become and asked if I could come by his house the next day. He had a business proposition for me. I told him I would and sat amid the remaining rubble throughout the trailer. Disgusted with myself, I collected every can, tidied up the trailer as best I could, showered, shaved, and made sure I had a change of clean clothes. When I arrived at the appointed time, Robert held out his hand for a handshake. I said, "I'm sorry about yesterday, Mr. Lambert." He reminded me that he had told me to call him Robert as he led me inside. We went into his den, where a woman sat on the couch, leaning over the coffee table. She was poring over a series of maps and typing into a laptop computer. I couldn't help but notice the austere demeanor she projected. Her auburn hair was wrapped tightly in a bun, and she wore large reading glasses. Her face was scrunched in concentration, and her alabaster complexion, combined with her lack of makeup, did not conceal her attractive features. I noticed she was unusually tall for a woman, and I had the irrational thought of what it would be like to look into those vivid blue eyes straight on while kissing her. To complete her struggle to appear unattractive, her torso was adorned with a baggy Texas A&M sweatshirt, and her jeans were worn and baggy, as though she didn't care about impressing anyone. "Gail, I want you to meet John Perry." Gail peered over her glasses, and it was evident that I didn't impress her. I went to shake her hand, but I found myself as a source of disdain, captured in the laser beams of those deep blue eyes as she ignored my hand. "Mr. Perry, would you excuse us?" Not waiting for an answer, she stormed out of the room with Robert Lambert quickly trailing after her. They retired into what appeared to be the kitchen, and I became aware of an argument escalating by the minute. The noises were too muffled to make sense of until the very end, when I heard the woman yell, "Why do we need him?" To which Robert replied, "Because I said so." When they came out, it was apparent that though a truce may be in effect, a brush war could reignite at any instant. "John, I'm sorry for the interruption. Let me finish introducing you to my granddaughter, Gail Lambert." Gail gave a fleeting smile, but her eyes did not match the smile. As Robert continued, "Gail is a recent graduate from Texas A&M in business agriculture, and she came to me with some very interesting news. So I'm going to let Gail take over now. Mr. Perry, what do you know of Shreveport, Louisiana?" she asked. "If you don't mind, why don't you call me John?" I replied. "As for your question, not much. I know they have a racetrack at Bossier City, and some casinos over there." Gail rephrased the question. "Mr. Perry, do you know anything about the history of Shreveport?" "No, I don't," I answered. "Have you ever heard of Captain Henry Shreve?" After thinking about it, I said, "No, I can't say I have." "What about the Great Raft, Mr. Perry? Have you ever heard of it?" I responded, "Wasn't that the Kon-Tiki boat that Thor, what's his name, sailed?" The woman rolled her eyes in exasperation. "No, Mr. Perry. Close to 800 years ago, a logjam formed on the Red River. For centuries, trees unearthed in the river continued to float down, becoming part of this massive logjam. At its peak, the logjam stretched 150 miles upstream, so thick that many streams, tributaries, and lakes formed as a result. You could actually walk on the river for miles and never see water. Over time, many of those trees lost their buoyancy and sank to the bottom of the river or its tributaries. Eventually, Captain Shreve was assigned the task of clearing the logjam to make the Red River navigable. In gratitude for his efforts, the town of Shreveport was named in his honor. I interrupted. "That's a very interesting history lesson, Mom, but I understood this was a business meeting. Why is this important?" "Mr. Perry," Gail replied, "have you ever seen lumber made from water-stained wood? It is exquisite, and more importantly, expensive. My grandfather and your grandparents are sitting on a gold mine. It's slowly sinking about my grandparents and Robert Lambert's land abutting the bank of the Red River. With all the tributaries, lakes, and wetlands, there is no telling how much timber has been buried over the years. True, the main channel of the Red River is constantly being dredged, but off to the sides, who knows what is lying in the murky depths? Okay, this sounds very intriguing, but how do you propose to access this gold?" I asked. "That's where you and I come in," Robert interjected. "I will outlay the cash to purchase a large pontoon boat complete with 3 winches. Gail will map out the areas most likely to have sunken timbers. You will dive on the timbers, hook the winch chains onto them, and once the timber is up, it will be cradled between the pontoons and taken ashore. We will jury-rig a crane to load the timbers onto a log truck to be transported to a sawmill built where I had the old barn you raised. From there, it will be cut into lumber, and we will sell either wholesale or retail, depending on the profit margin. There is no telling how much we can make out of this if it is handled right. Okay, Robert, what's the split? I asked. You get 10%. Gail interjected before Robert could comment. No, Gail, Robert said. I told you we were going to be fair about this. John, for providing all the sweat equity, you get 50%. Gail and I will share the remaining 50%. Gail Lambert appeared ready to boil over with betrayal at her grandfather's decision. She continued to glare at me for the rest of the evening while Robert and I discussed the requirements for the boat. Finally, we decided we had all the equipment contingencies covered, and I told them good night. As I walked out, Gail trailed behind me and stood on the porch as I walked down the steps. Mr. Perry, she called. I turned around and looked up at her. Even as she glared down at me, I was struck again by her potential beauty. I just want to say, Mr. Perry, that I'm not on board with you being partners with my grandfather and me. As far as I see it, we are giving away money to have you on this venture, and as far as I'm concerned, the day my grandfather realizes you are just baggage will be a happy day. It must have been a reaction to all the events transpiring, but I let her have it. Miss Lambert, I don't know who pissed in your cornflakes, and I don't care. I came into your house at your grandfather's invitation, and you've been a total witch the whole time. I was willing to give you the benefit of the doubt, but to come out here and talk to me as though I was a dog is the last straw. You don't know what I've been going through, and you have no idea who I am as a person. I'm tired of people pushing me around, and if you think for a second that I'm going to let you do that, you've got another thing coming. As I stormed off, I saw her mouth agape and then rushing indoors, presumably to tell Robert how I had mistreated her. I started to wonder what it was about me that pissed off women. I figured I would soon find out if Robert still wanted to be partners. If not, I would have to continue scrambling to earn a living. When I arrived the next morning, nothing was mentioned by Robert, and the only indication of the previous evening's tension was a momentary glimpse of a red-headed wraith adorned in a Texas A&M shirt, slamming her bedroom door shut. After our mutual flinch and waiting for the reverberations to cease, Robert and I both had the same junior high school boy smile on our faces. After that snicker, we continued discussing what we would need to transport the logs and what we would need for our sawmill. A couple of times, we heard the door open, and we buried ourselves in paperwork as Gail traversed through on whatever mission she was on. The last time she went back into her room, I commented, "She sure is loyal to her school." Robert replied, "Since she's been back home, she's worn a Texas Aggie shirt every day." I knew people who were fanatical about their schools, but Gail didn't strike me as that type. In a week, we had the boat outfitted and ready for a trial run. The construction of the sawmill would wait until we determined the feasibility of the venture. If we couldn't dredge up enough timber to make it profitable, Robert could resell most of the equipment and not sustain too much of a loss. For me, it would mean losing a day's wage until my finances hit rock bottom. I was desperate for this venture to work and give me some breathing room. Robert, after consulting with Gail, decided we should start on a small tributary where we could work out of sight. I was surprised to see Gail joining us the next morning. She was wearing yet another A&M shirt and packing items into the bed of my pickup. We all loaded up and drove to a suitable spot to launch the pontoon boat. Gail sat in the back and didn't participate in the conversation. I drove the boat a short distance and then killed the engine. We slowly drifted as I picked up a large bamboo pole and started probing it into the water. After a few minutes, I felt a solid thunk and anchored the boat. I had my old scuba gear from when I was in the service, but the water was shallow enough that my mask and snorkel would work. I dove into the murky depths and felt the slimy texture of a large object. As I explored, I estimated it was larger than my arm span and about 60 feet long. I surfaced and told Robert and Gail that we had found our first log. They excitedly ran the line from one of the winches, and I dove again. I found a way to encircle the log with the winch wire and hook the connection. Once I surfaced and climbed into the boat, I engaged the winch to start drawing in the line. As the slack was taken up, I noticed the boat settling deeper into the water. The winch continued to strain, and the boat's bow began to dip while the stern rose precariously. Neither Robert nor Gail had much experience with boats, but I had enjoyed fishing as a teenager and had some heavy machinery experience from my construction job, which gave me a clue on how to handle the situation. Suddenly, the suction holding the log to the bottom gave way, and the line from the winch rolled in easily. Gail's face lit up with anticipation, and as the tip of the log appeared in the sunlight for the first time in untold years, she let out a hearty laugh. I was back in the water, ready to run the second line around the log, now tilted at an angle. I swam under the timber to hook up the winch line from the other side. Once again, I surfaced and took control of the second winch. The log came up easily, and soon we had our first log strapped to the boat. This called for celebration. Robert and I shook hands and patted each other on the back, while Gail and I stood beside each other awkwardly until we drifted apart. I slowly drove the boat toward the shallow end of the water near the ramp. We determined that we had dredged up a cypress tree, one of the more sought-after timbers. We continued working that day and ended up with 5 cypress trees ready to be harvested. On the drive back, we discussed how to proceed. Gail spoke only about business and directed her comments to Robert. We decided I would drive the boat directly to the site in the morning to continue harvesting logs, while Robert and Gail would purchase the logging truck and bring it to the riverbank. Using a loading arch, winches, log tongs, and chains on the trailer, the logs would be loaded and transported to an existing sawmill. With that capital outlay, we would begin constructing our own sawmill. I got up before dawn and drove back to the lake, launching the boat as the sun rose. I found the first log and dove back into the water, not considering how chilly it would be that early in the morning. After securing the log, I hurried to my truck, turned it on, and let the heater combat the early signs of hypothermia. I realized there were still some lessons to be learned in harvesting the logs. Then I remembered my scuba gear on board and was relieved to find that the neoprene wetsuit still fit. It would help mitigate the chill of the water until I was warmed by the truck heater or the sun. By the time Robert and Gail arrived with the truck, we had additional logs to add to our collection. I backed the truck up and attached the tongs and chains to assist the arch in winching the timbers onto the truck. The process was arduous and inefficient, but the cheapest way to load until our business scale justified using a log crane. Since I had the most experience, Robert and Gail watched my efforts closely. As I finished chaining the last log, I overheard Robert asking Gail if she still thought I was unnecessary. The silence was gratifying, though Gail continued to barely tolerate my presence. Finally, I had enough logs loaded for the first run. The remaining logs waited in the shallow water for their turn. I drove the logging truck to the sawmill where we had planned to offload the logs and where our expected buyer was waiting. Gail and Robert drove ahead of me. At the log yard, the trailer was weighed and inspected by the buyer, who eventually gave a number I was agreeable to. It was here that Gail proved her worth. She reminded the buyer of the current price and how demand was outpacing supply. She also pointed out that the price did not account for the grade and size of our logs. The buyer would get double the board feet from our logs and needed to pay accordingly. After some negotiation, they reached a price that impressed both Robert and me. Arrangements were made for the second load, and the buyer promised a check. Eager to get the second load on the trailer and into the log yard, I began to accept Gail as a necessary part of the team. I hoped she would come to see things my way. Each morning, I continued taking the boat out to start the workday. I invested in a couple of items, a Zippo lighter and a chimenea, a portable ceramic fireplace that emitted a significant amount of heat. Before heading out on the boat, I would light a fire in the chimenea and warm up before retrieving the first log of the day. By mid-morning, the sun usually warmed the water enough that I could skip using the chimenea. Gail scoffed at my need for breaks, attributing them to laziness. I remarked that for someone who wore nothing but Texas A&M t-shirts, she certainly had a lot of opinions no one cared about. Her reaction was dramatic. She gasped for air and ran to Robert's car, leaving him stranded with me for the day. I told Robert I didn't think my comment was that offensive as we went to collect another log. By now, the sawmill was operational and Gail and Robert had hired a couple of people to run it. Though unspoken, it was clear Gail was pushing Robert to end our partnership and hire a boat crew. To his credit, Robert refused to listen to Gail. I mostly saw Gail when the three of us went on boat runs to scout new areas. Gail's research always led us to new logs to harvest, but her latest complaint was that my perceived sloth was causing delays. Robert pointed out that I generally kept ahead of the sawmill crew, and I had a small surplus of logs ready. Thank goodness for that, as when I took off for Saturday's visitation, Gail seemed ready to explode. "How dare I take a day off?" she said. I pointed out that the sawmill crew didn't work on weekends, so my personal day wouldn't affect the operation. I spent another sad, lonely hour looking at the door and clock, waiting for a visit that wasn't going to happen. Robert had suggested I insist the kids attend the visitation, but I argued that forcing them to do something they resented would only create more problems. I wanted them to come willingly. After wasting half the day Saturday, I unloaded a log haul late that afternoon and prepared for 3 more hauls on Sunday. The work continued to be a balm for my heartache as I thought about Stephen and Carol. Oddly, I felt little concern for Stella, who had so treacherously destroyed our marriage. As fall approached, Gail's efforts to undermine me escalated. The increasing cold further hampered my efforts, requiring longer breaks to warm up before diving for the logs. That led to fewer hauls of my timber and more of pine and oak logs that Robert contracted with other logging outfits for the sawmill operation. Gail argued that this justified terminating the partnership. I found it oddly reminiscent of Stella's efforts to undermine me. From my perspective, I saw no valid reason for their actions. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I must have done something to provoke them. I spent another lonely Saturday, my unanswered prayers mingling with my doubts as I drove home, wondering if I would ever feel complete again. I didn't receive any divine guidance. A couple of weeks passed, and my results continued to deteriorate. I suggested to Robert that it might be time to suspend diving until spring. I could see Gail's satisfaction at the falling results, which seemed to align with her agenda. Then she threw a curveball. She wanted to scout locations on the Red River the next day. Despite our success with the tributaries, Robert had a prior commitment in Houston, so he couldn't join us. Gail debated whether she could tolerate being alone with me on the boat, but eventually decided to go. The next morning, I picked her up. She hurried past me in her maroon Texas A&M sweatshirt and jeans and got into my truck. Robert, preparing to leave, jokingly told me not to kill her. I took a deep breath and drove off. We spent the day exploring various spots on the river. Our only conversations were when she directed me to a new location or when I informed her that I had found a log using my bamboo pole. I could identify timber by touch, and Gail noted the locations on her portable GPS. Several troubling facts emerged: the river's depth and rapid current. I had to drop an additional anchor line to prevent the boat from drifting as we searched. The swift-moving silt made diving particularly hazardous. I knew I'd need scuba gear to stay underwater long enough to secure the winch lines. This would be a dangerous endeavor, requiring a refresher scuba course and a dive partner. The lessons from my past training emphasized never diving alone. As I watched Gail input data into her GPS, it struck me that she probably never intended for me to dive on these logs. By spring, she would likely convince Robert that I was no longer needed, pushing for a cheaper crew to take over the project. The thought of her orchestrating my removal filled me with bitterness. I turned away, avoiding eye contact as the late afternoon sun began to set. As the day dimmed into evening, I heard a sudden yell and a loud splash. I turned to find Gail missing from the bow of the boat. I saw an object being swept downstream and realized it was Gail, struggling to swim against the current. As she screamed for help, I ran to the stern, dove into the water, and swam after her. She was about 50 yards downstream, already submerged by the undertow. Despite the numbing cold, I knew diving in was the right choice. Gail was panicking, trying to swim upstream when she should have been moving downstream to reach the riverbank. I couldn't get the boat moving quickly enough to catch up, so I focused on keeping her in sight. She managed to reach the surface briefly, but her energy was fading fast. I had to reach her before she got caught in another undertow or collided with a snag. I gained ground as her voice weakened, still slicing through the water to reach her. Just as I was mid-stroke, an unidentified snag rammed into my torso, causing a sharp pain that made me gasp and suck in muddy river water, which I sputtered out as best I could. Ignoring the pain, I continued toward Gail, closing the distance from 30 feet to 20 feet, then 15 feet, 10 feet, and finally 5 feet. I saw the desperation in her face before she submitted to the current, her arms flailing in a final attempt to grasp me. Now, I faced the challenge of her clinging to me, potentially dragging us both under. I waited for the right moment and reached out, grabbing her by the hair. Using my injured hand for the task made the effort excruciating, but I held on. Her discomfort from the tugging on her hair caused her to grip my arm more firmly, which was a small advantage. I carefully guided us toward the riverbank, pushing against the current. Approaching a large sandbar, I felt my knee hit sand. I released Gail and started to scramble upright. She panicked again, trying to grab me, but soon realized she was on solid ground. We both crawled up the sandbar, gasping for breath and shivering from the cold. Collapsing into the wet sand, we struggled to recover from the shock. Despite my numb fingers and toes, I crawled up the bank, gathering dry pine straw and oak leaves from the peninsula of the sandbar. Returning to Gail, I shielded the materials from the wind and fumbled with my Zippo lighter, desperately trying to ignite a fire. Hypothermia was setting in, and without warmth, we could both perish. My thumb rotated the lighter's wheel, and I prayed it would work despite the potential for contamination from the river water. As the first sparks flew and the weak flame appeared, I sobbed with relief. Holding the flame to the dry tinder, I willed it to catch fire. Gradually, the flame grew stronger, and I fed it more leaves. I then scrambled for more dry straw and twigs to keep the fire burning. I urged Gail to strip out of her wet clothes to prevent further chilling, but she hesitated. I told her again, more firmly this time, to undress or risk death from the cold. The urgency in my voice snapped her to action, and she began removing her clothes. While I kept feeding the fire, I noticed Gail's back as she struggled with her jeans and later her bra and panties. Although the sight was compelling, I focused on keeping the fire alive. Once I had a sufficient stockpile, I undressed as well, feeling the cold keenly but prioritizing warmth over propriety. We were two shivering figures around a campfire, seeking to regain our strength in the cold. As the warmth returned, I noticed Gail began to cry quietly. I respected her need for privacy while still offering comfort. Her sobs grew into full-blown hysteria, and I could no longer stand by. I went to her, sat by her, and embraced her, offering solace as she cried into the night. There was nothing sexual in my gesture. We were simply two people, stripped of the trappings of civilization, trying to survive in a harsh, indifferent world. As she buried her head against me, I caressed her gently, letting her know that I was there to support her. Her crying gradually subsided, and she remained in my arms. When she looked at me and quietly said, "Thank you," it broke the spell, and we both felt the discomfort of our nakedness. I returned to my previous spot, and we stared into the fire from our separate positions. I broke the silence to tell her I would get some wood to dry her clothes. As I got up, she averted her gaze. When I returned with some wood, I placed it nearby and announced I would go farther into the bank for more wood. She recognized this as my way of respecting her privacy while she prepared her clothes. I waited as long as I could away from the fire before returning. To my surprise, she had also laid out my clothes to dry. I thanked her quietly, and once again, we averted our gazes from each other. It must have looked comical from anyone else's perspective. Two grown adults in a life-or-death situation, unable to overcome the awkwardness of simply looking at each other. We seemed to mutually agree that we didn't have permission to make eye contact, so we waited as our clothes dried. We would occasionally test our clothes for dryness by reaching out and touching them. Once they were dry enough, we turned away from each other and quickly dressed. When we were finally dressed, it was time to discuss our situation. "Gail, we need to decide what to do," I said. "Here are the facts. We're stranded on the riverbank. No one knows our predicament, and our phones are ruined. Your grandfather won't be back until tomorrow. Our options are to stay here and hope for rescue, or for Robert to notice we're missing and start a search. Alternatively, I could leave you here with enough firewood, walk upstream through the woods to get the boat, and come back to get you. What do you want me to do?" Without hesitation, Gail said she wanted to get home as quickly as possible. I expected that answer. Everyone would likely choose the same without considering the consequences. I would have to navigate the riverbank upstream in the dark, in tennis shoes, over sharp roots and dense brush. I'd stumble into the cold October night, find the boat, and then dive back into the frigid water to start it up and return to rescue her. I went into the woods one last time to gather firewood, quick-burning pine and longer-lasting oak. I told Gail to stay with the fire and keep it burning if I didn't return. When daylight came, she might see a boat and get rescued. I would follow the riverbank and try to stay within earshot of any potential rescuers. As I began to leave, Gail threw herself at me in an impulsive hug. I wanted to stay locked in her embrace, but I had made a promise and needed to keep it. I walked away and quickly entered uncharted territory. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness as I walked with my arms outstretched, navigating through brush and bramble. I stumbled and fell frequently, my ribs aching from the impact. The river ran below me, tempting me with its cold embrace. I lost all sense of time as I continued, shivering in the cold. The river's rapid current had carried us far. It could have been a mile or 5 miles. Despair set in as I struggled to find the boat, knowing Gail was alone and worried. This thought motivated me to keep going. Finally, I rounded a rise in the bank and saw the dark silhouette of the boat bobbing in the river. I steeled myself for the cold and prepared to jump in again. Summoning my courage, I leaped into the river, bracing for the bone-chilling cold. My body was suffering from another relapse, and I could sense it quickly shutting down. The cold had my fingers cramped, and I barely managed to reach and grasp the boat ladder on the starboard side. Somehow, I climbed aboard and hurried to start the engine. The trusty mercury outboard roared to life, and I jumped to the toolbox to grab the flashlight and knife. I turned on the light and cut through each anchor line, causing the boat to drift. I ran to the cockpit, pushed the throttle forward for maximum speed, and turned on the navigational lights. As I entered the main channel, I was determined to avoid any unseen hazards. The cold was unbearable, and the wind chill threatened to drop my body temperature dangerously low. I squinted into the dark, searching for signs of the campfire. There it was, an orange pinprick, with a figure waving desperately. I shut off the throttle and killed the engine, allowing the boat to drift to a stop on the sandbar. The welcoming cheers from Gail abruptly ceased when she saw my condition. Realizing what I had endured, she rushed to help me, moving me close to the fire. She threw all the wood onto the fire, causing it to blaze brightly and illuminate the sandbar. Then she undressed me, cursing me while crying as she saw the scratches and bruises on my body. I curled up in the fetal position around the fire and mercifully passed out, still hearing her angry words. When I woke up, I was still in the fetal position. The fire was roaring, a new stockpile of wood was nearby, and my clothes were drying by the fire. Gail was behind me, pressing her body against my back to provide warmth. Groggy, I asked her how long I had been out. She replied that it wasn't important. I just needed to rest and stay warm. We remained in that position, and of all the scenarios I had imagined with Gail, this was one I hadn't considered. Gail began apologizing profusely, saying she wouldn't have asked me to do it if she had known what it would involve. I told her to stop. No one forced me to do it. We stayed that way until my clothes were steaming and smoldering from the fire's heat. Gail quickly adjusted the clothes to finish drying and then returned to her position. I started to think I could grow accustomed to this arrangement. When she announced that my clothes were dry, she went into the woods to allow me to dress alone. I started up the boat, and at that signal, she reappeared. Despite the barrier of sand, I asked Gail to help me douse the fire with sand. It was a bit sad to see the last embers die out, the life-sustaining fire coming to an end. I reversed the boat and turned on the navigation lights again. Gail walked in front of me, half sitting, half standing at the captain's chair in the cockpit. We continued to share body heat as we made our way to the marina. When Gail got cold from shielding me, she would retreat behind me until she was ready to return to the front. The marina appeared across the river, and I crossed the channel and entered its harbor. I was in no shape to load the boat onto the trailer, so I found an unoccupied slip, tied the boat off, and killed the engine. The marina was deserted at that late hour. If anyone took offense, they could contact the Coast Guard to run the registration number and reach out to Robert, who would then contact me. We limped to my truck, and I turned on the heat to full as it began to warm the cab. I saw a grateful smile on Gail's face as we began the final miles to her house. We hadn't spoken much since leaving the marina, and I was getting drowsy from the heat. I asked her to talk to keep me awake. For the first time, I listened to her soft, melodious voice, free of the harshness I was used to. The miles passed too quickly, and as we arrived at her house, I had mixed emotions. I was happy to have gotten her home safely after such a harrowing experience, but sad that she would likely leave me, and her temporary truce would probably end. As I stopped in her driveway, I was anxious about the 20 minutes left on my drive home, and worried I might fall asleep at the wheel. Gail got out of the truck, and instead of bidding me good night, looked at me and said, "Don't even think you're going anywhere." She turned and went into the house, and I meekly followed her. Inside, she commanded me to build a fire in the fireplace. "I know you can do that," she said. "I've seen you in action." I prepared to light the fire, but found my Zippo lighter wouldn't ignite. As I struck one of the long-stemmed matches, I thought about how precarious our lives were, balancing on a whim. In minutes, the flames lit up and began feeding on the seasoned oak from Robert's tinderbox that I used in the fireplace. Gail came out with 2 oversized ceramic mugs, steaming with chicken noodle soup. "I'm afraid I can only offer you this from the can. Next time, I promise it'll be homemade," she said, setting the mugs on the coffee table. She then fetched some thick woolen blankets from the hallway closet and told me to sit on the sofa. I hesitated, looking at my dirty, bloody clothes, still gritty with sand. "Oh, for God's sake, John, it's just a couch." "I'll get it cleaned again," she insisted. It was the first time she used my name, and I realized how much I had come to value it. She wrapped a blanket around me and handed me a mug of soup. Then she wrapped herself in another blanket and slowly sipped her soup. We settled side by side, staring into the fire in the darkened den, sipping our soup. I placed my empty mug back on the table, and Gail did the same. We continued to gaze into the fire, and I became mesmerized by the shifting hues of orange from the glowing embers, which reminded me of Gail's hair. Gail shifted closer and rested her head against my shoulder. We remained like that for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft and timid. "I'm going to tell you a story. I don't want you to interrupt. I don't want you to say anything until I'm finished." She began, still looking into the fire. "About 2 months before I graduated, I met this guy from school and started dating him. He looked a lot like you. Tall, brown hair, cute smile, green eyes. I was getting really attached to him, but wanted to make sure he was the one. So I kept stalling whenever he talked about taking things to the next level. He acted like he understood but kept pushing. Gail paused, placing her hand on my covered bicep for support. On graduation day, we celebrated by going out to an expensive restaurant. When I excused myself to use the restroom, I came back to find an expensive bottle of wine uncorked. "Only the best for you," he said, raising his glass in a toast to us. He declared, "May we always be happy." I returned a smile and savored the thought of our future. 6 hours later, I was being transported to the hospital by ambulance. My roommates had come home and found me sprawled on the living room floor, my dress ripped, exposing bruised and bitten skin. My brow was broken, causing a large friction burn on my rib cage. Unable to wake me, they called 911. When I arrived at the hospital, they performed a toxicology screen and found I was under the influence of Rohypnol, a date rape drug. I was shocked when they also performed a rape kit and found evidence of sexual assault. DNA was extracted, but there was no way to tell if I had contracted anything. I was prescribed numerous medications to ensure I was okay, and I'm still on some of them, and going for checkups. The detective investigating my case kept asking for the perpetrator's name, but I was shielding him. It's not uncommon for victims to run and pretend it didn't happen or think it was their fault. The detective told me to call him if I decided to cooperate. I went home and wore my maroon Texas A&M shirt, my own personal scarlet letter. It was a constant reminder of my connection to my abuser. Each day, I wore it as a shield, a way to hide my shame and pain. People saw only a woman with a college logo. They didn't see the torment I carried. Gail's hand was painfully clenching my bicep as she continued to delve into her trauma. I withdrew from my friends, who urged me to seek counseling or report the assault. I sank deeper into my own hell, hating myself more each day. Eventually, I called my grandfather and asked if I could stay with him. Of course, he said yes, and so I went down and began to find some solace in the beauty of the land. As I explored, I remembered a history lecture and started researching, thinking that committing to this project might ease my shame a little. My grandfather suggested involving you, and although I agreed, I was taken aback when I saw who you reminded me of. Each day, I had to endure the daily reminder of that logo, seeing you and struggling to ignore my discomfort. She took a deep breath before continuing, her voice rising in pitch. I suppose I'd still be looking for a way to get rid of you if I hadn't tripped over my own foot and fallen overboard. She began to cry again, recalling the experience. Oh God, I was so afraid, so alone, and so cold. I tried to swim back to the boat, but something dragged me under the water. Then I was back on the surface, gasping for air, trying to reach you, but it felt like I was getting further away. Everything was a blur as you grabbed my hair. I wanted to hold on to you so you could save me, but the pain made me let go. You pushed me onto the sandbar, and the chilly air paralyzed me. I could only watch as you built the fire, feeling the warmth return. When you ordered me to take off my clothes, I had a flashback and didn't want to obey. I thought you might rip my clothes off and assault me. I sat there, paralyzed, waiting for you to dominate and abuse me. But then you started to warm yourself. Each second gave me new hope. I realized you were not the monster from my past, and I began to feel ashamed of everything I had projected onto you. I started crying, and you came over, naked, and sat next to me, cradling me in your arms. I felt protected. An hour before our mishap, if you had touched me, I would have screamed. Now both of us were naked, and I felt safe in your arms. I wondered why it took me so long to realize my mistake. As Gail's tears flowed, I managed to get my arm out from under the blanket and around her, holding her silently as the fire continued to die down. When I woke up, I felt her stirring, and we both saw Robert looking down at us with disbelief. I wouldn't believe this if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Can someone tell me what the hell our boat is doing in the marina? And why weren't either of you answering your phones? Gail and I untangled ourselves and stood up, and she looked at me expectantly. I knew what she was asking. You have to tell him, I said. I'm going to get the boat and come right back. Then we'll decide what to do. As I left, Gail and Robert walked to the kitchen table to explain everything. I managed to apologize to the marina owner and made a $100 donation, which included staff loading the boat onto my trailer. When I returned to Robert's place, he was still at the kitchen table, pale, and trying to process the events. I asked where Gail was, and he told me she was taking a shower. We started discussing things from our perspective when Gail appeared, still wearing her college logo shirt. No, I said firmly. You're done paying a penance. You don't owe anyone anything. Get upstairs and put on something else. Gail was shocked by my reaction, but I wanted her to move past that symbol of her trauma. When she came back down in a flowery blouse, I opened my arms, and she smiled, rushing to hug me. Damn, my ribs still hurt, I said. She then looked at Robert, who invited her into his arms and hugged her for a long time. He insisted on taking us to the hospital to be checked over. It turned out my ribs were severely bruised and needed to be wrapped tightly. Various cuts were cleaned, and prescriptions for antiseptics and painkillers were given. Luckily, aside from suffering from exposure, Gail had no residual physical injuries. The next day, we made plans to drive to College Station. Gail went into the police station with us and gave a complete statement to the detective, naming her assailant. We then met with her roommates, who listened to her story in its entirety. They rushed to show their love and affection for their friend, hugging me as well. I knew I'd need extra painkillers to handle the emotions from their heartfelt gestures. Gail asked if her friends could find a therapist close to her grandfather's place, and soon, 10 phones were working to get that information. Since Robert was driving us, I had the front passenger seat for comfort. Gail continued to check on me during the drive. When we got back to Robert's house, she insisted I stay in the guest room. She said I had no business staying in the small trailer without someone to look after me. I couldn't wait for her to say something like that in front of my grandmother. They got along great when they first met. Gail offered to drive me to the visitation since I was still on painkillers and shouldn't drive. It was a welcome change to have someone to talk to during that hour of anticipation. By November, I was off the painkillers, but Gail still wanted to accompany me, providing a much-needed distraction from my anguish. In December, after a fruitless visit, she helped load the gifts back into my truck. I had purchased them on the off chance they would be needed. Gail suggested donating the gifts to charity, which seemed like a fitting idea. Things were progressing well for Gail. Her assailant had been arrested, and his DNA matched. A search of his phone revealed he had recorded the entire incident. Instead of delaying, he and his attorney opted for a quick trial. Gail, despite her initial reluctance to cooperate, gave a detailed account of her ordeal on the witness stand. The jury returned with a maximum sentence on every charge. The bailiff mentioned they would have returned even faster if they could have given him more time. Our relationship continued to develop comfortably. I was involved in some of Gail's therapy sessions and made it clear I would do whatever I could to support her. The therapist assured me Gail was aware of my commitment. As spring arrived, Gail and I returned to the Red River to recover the data we had lost. I insisted she wear a life jacket for the entire trip. Although she wouldn't tell me what was in the large boxes Robert had loaded on the boat, she eventually asked to go to the sandbar where she had fallen in. I complied and set up a camp as she requested. I built a fire in the same spot as before, set up a tent, inflated an air mattress, and prepared a selection of campfire food: hot dogs, marshmallows, sodas, bottled water, and a bottle of champagne chilling in the cooler. We enjoyed the simple pleasure of our outing, talking and interacting with a familiarity that had become new to us. As we relaxed, I gently brushed my hand through her auburn curls. She reminded me that I had been rough the first time I did that on the sandbar. I apologized and asked how I could make it up to her. She said a kiss would be a good start. I leaned in and softly kissed her. As I broke away, she asked for more kisses, and our hands began to explore each other. When she was ready, she removed her t-shirt, and we both began to shed our clothes, creating a mutual pile. Acknowledging our desire for comfort, I spread a large picnic blanket over the sand and lay beside her. I admired her flawless skin, deep blue eyes, and full lips. I kissed her from head to toe, savoring every moment. As we became more intimate, we found a rhythm that brought us both pleasure. Gail and I fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms. I woke in the middle of the night to a sky full of stars in the moonless darkness. Gail was close to me, and I could sense her presence even as the stars were obscured. I gently nuzzled her and whispered for her to look at the stars. As we moved together, the tranquility of the night enveloped us once more. Early at dawn, I awoke to a heavy fog blanketing the area in light gray clouds. I watched Gail peacefully sleeping and placed a soft kiss on her. She stirred with a faint smile, and after a few moments, opened her eyes to give me a bigger smile and another kiss. We soon found ourselves making love again, this time with me sitting on the sand and Gail nestled in my lap. We covered ourselves with another blanket, getting lost in our rhythm. Gail then stood up, spreading her arms and holding onto the blanket as if presenting herself to the world, though the world consisted only of me. She walked to the edge of the sandbar and waded into the water, gradually acclimating to its coolness. Meanwhile, I had started cooking breakfast. The bacon sizzled in the skillet, and I swapped it for eggs. Gail must have sensed the food was ready because she emerged from the water and approached me. As she walked toward me, my hunger shifted from food to something else entirely. Gail touched my cheek and promised to fulfill my needs after we ate. True to her word, we enjoyed our meal and then walked hand in hand into the water, gently bathing each other. By mutual agreement, we began dressing as the fog lifted, revealing warm sunlight. I packed up everything, including the tent, air mattress, and sleeping bag that we hadn't used. I thought about planning another trip soon. On the way back to the launch ramp, things were going well until I started receiving unsolicited messages from Stella, my ex-wife. I had been determined not to let her have any power over me, so I ignored them. Eventually, my divorce attorney called to say Stella wanted to see me about a proposition. He assured me that meeting her in his office wouldn't breach any court orders. I discussed it with Gail, who thought it might be worth finding out what Stella wanted. So I found myself in the lawyer's conference room when Stella walked in. The past few years had not been kind to her. After her marriage to Ted, who had fathered twins with her, it seemed that managing 4 children had taken a toll. Stella looked worn out, with extra weight, bags under her eyes, and frown lines. She sat down and asked how I was doing. I decided to skip the pleasantries and asked bluntly what she wanted. Stella was initially thrown off balance and began stammering. I told her to speak plainly or I would leave. She took a deep breath and asked if I wanted custody of the children. I asked her what the catch was. Stella assured me there was no catch and explained that if I wanted the children, she would have custody awarded to me and would have visitation rights. I asked her why she was offering this now. She snapped back, demanding if I wanted the children or not. I told her I would consider it only if she answered some questions first. Stella revealed that, after our divorce, Ted had wanted to take revenge on me by turning the children against me and spoiling them. When I nearly exposed them, Ted's resentment led him to further punish me by taking the children away and buying their affection. Stella said Ted had resented me for continuing to care for Stephen and Carol while he focused on his own children. As Stella started to cry, I waited for her to explain further. She said Ted had shifted his affection to the twins, leaving Stephen and Carol feeling rejected. Stella's revelations about our children were sobering. She described how Stephen had fallen in with a bad crowd and Carol was involved with a much older boyfriend. The notion of my 15-year-old son being a juvenile delinquent and my 13-year-old daughter dating an adult was unsettling. I remembered the bright, beautiful children they once were and struggled to understand how they had ended up so lost. Stella's sudden offer to transfer custody came as a shock, especially after 5 years of estrangement. Her reason for the change of heart was unexpected. She was pregnant again. Her decision to abandon Stephen and Carol felt like a cruel twist of fate, and I was left with a profound sense of disgust and frustration. I wanted nothing more than to return to Gail and find solace in her arms. We finalized the custody arrangements with mutual agreement. When we finished, Stella seemed to expect a gesture of reconciliation, but I remained distant. She offered a handshake, which I ignored. After she left, the legal change of custody went through smoothly, though it was disheartening that no one questioned the suitability of the arrangement. The day of the exchange, I watched as Stephen and Carol arrived, their faces sullen and their suitcases packed. I was filled with regret for the lost years. When I reached out to hug them, they responded with indifference. I knew rebuilding our relationship would take time, especially after years of denigration from Stella and Ted. As I loaded their luggage into the vehicle, Stephen lit a cigarette. I promptly took it from him and threw it away, asserting that he would follow my rules while under my care. Carol's reaction to being disciplined for the first time in years was shock and silence. They both got into the truck, apprehensive about what lay ahead. During the drive, I tried to engage them in conversation, but they responded with silence or sarcasm. At one point, Carol answered a phone call from her 22-year-old boyfriend. His vile comments prompted me to throw the phone out the window, which left Carol furious and without a phone. I asked her where she planned to get a replacement, which silenced her. Arriving at my grandparents' home, I noticed the children had difficulty accepting the warmth and affection from their great-grandparents. Grandma reminisced about the joyful times they had spent at the farm. Carol's unexpected smile at the mention of the ducks and Stephen's fishing activities signaled a glimmer of past happiness. I proposed a trip on the pontoon boat the next day for fishing and duck watching. Their reluctance was evident, and I realized that rebuilding our family bonds would be a long and challenging process. As the evening approached, Stephen inquired about where they would be staying. I informed him that I had bought the old Andrews place, and Gail was preparing the rooms for them. As we approached my house, I explained to Stephen and Carol that they would be meeting Gail's grandfather, Robert Lambert, who was not only Gail's grandfather, but also my business partner. Stephen, still carrying his attitude, made snide comments about Gail. When he sneered, "So you're with her, huh?" I gave him a stern look and reminded him of the lesson from earlier. I made it clear that Gail deserved as much respect as anyone else, and I wouldn't tolerate any rudeness. Upon arriving at the large ranch, Carol and Stephen were taken aback by the size of the house and the surrounding property. They were excited to see the horses and the swimming pool, but quickly masked their enthusiasm to maintain their cool teenage demeanor. Their resistance melted away when they met Gail. She greeted Stephen with a warm hug and a bright smile, which seemed to make him soften immediately. Gail extended the same kindness to Carol and then showed them to their rooms, which were spacious and well-equipped, complete with computers, TVs, and private baths. The beautiful black walnut furniture in their rooms was a point of interest, revealing more about our business and how we could afford the house. Gail had a special surprise for Carol, a Labrador Retriever puppy with a red bow. Carol was overjoyed, scooping up the puppy and naming her Pepper, much to the puppy's delight. The warmth and excitement from Carol's reaction were heartening. I took Stephen outside to reveal another surprise, a 1964 Ford Mustang in need of refurbishment. I hoped this would be a project we could work on together. Stephen's reaction was mixed. He was caught between his desire to be angry with me and his interest in the car. I left him to ponder over it while the rest of us enjoyed a barbecue in the backyard. During the evening, Carol was learning how to train Pepper from Grandpa, while Stephen lingered around Gail, eager to impress her. Gail handled his attention with grace, avoiding any ridicule. As we said goodnight and retired to our room, I noticed Stephen's hard expression, indicative of his internal struggle. The next day, We enrolled Stephen and Carol in their new school. That evening, I resumed our routine of discussing their day. I insisted on hearing about their lessons and informed them of my involvement with the PTA to ensure their education was top-notch. Stephen initially refused to work on the car, a decision I attributed to his conflicted feelings toward Gail. I mentioned Stephen's reaction to Gail later that night, and she shared that she was working on a plan to address it. I hoped her plan would be effective. As time went on, I focused on small victories and challenges with my children. One significant task was starting the hay baling from the fields to prepare fodder for the livestock. I enlisted Stephen to help me with baling hay, which meant loading and unloading bales as my grandfather drove the truck through the field. Unfortunately, Stephen had raided my stash of beer the night before and was hungover the next morning. I dragged him to the trailer and told Grandpa to start heading into the field. Despite his protests, I made him haul in the heavy, scratchy bales. In the heat of the day, Stephen became sick and threw up the remnants of the beer. He insisted he couldn't continue, so I tossed him a bottle of water and confronted him directly. I asked if he was going to quit on me just like his mother had, and without waiting for a response, I started moving a bale myself. This seemed to motivate Stephen, and he worked tirelessly, carrying 3 bales for everyone I moved. When the last bale was in the barn, he turned to me, sweaty and dusty, and muttered, "Go to hell," before heading to the house to shower. That evening, while we waited for Gail to arrive for a barbecue, Stephen continued to glare at me. Gail showed up with groceries and, surprisingly, was accompanied by her niece, Betty. When Stephen met Betty, he was clearly taken with her. Gail introduced Betty and asked Stephen to help carry the groceries. He eagerly jumped up to assist her. As the evening progressed, Stephen and Betty spent most of their time together, and Stephen was noticeably more engaged and cheerful. Betty's presence seemed to bring out the best in him. During the barbecue, Betty expressed her appreciation for Stephen's help, and Stephen offered to assist her with baling hay the following weekend. Betty was delighted and gave Stephen a hug, further solidifying their connection. While Stephen's mood improved, Carol remained fixated on her 22-year-old boyfriend. Despite my efforts to explain why the age difference was inappropriate and illegal, Carol continued to communicate with him, even using Stephen's phone. Betty eventually asked Stephen to stop supporting the relationship, which led to further tension. One day, Carol's boyfriend showed up at our door, announcing his intention to run away with her. Carol emerged with a suitcase, revealing that this had been planned. I told him to leave and not contact Carol until she was 18. Carol was determined to go with him, but Stephen managed to talk some sense into her. Later that night, I was awakened by a commotion. I found Carol's boyfriend attacking Stephen. Stephen had caught them trying to sneak out and confronted him, leading to a physical altercation. By the time deputies arrived, the boyfriend had sustained injuries, and I was held back from inflicting further harm. After the incident, the sheriff showed Carol explicit videos found in the boyfriend's car, revealing that he had been involved in exploiting underage girls. This shocking revelation helped Carol see the reality of her situation and the dangers of rushing into adulthood. Carol's boyfriend ended up facing serious consequences, spending the next 20 years in Huntsville, where he became entangled with a dangerous group. This was a hard but necessary shift for both Carol and Stephen. The final defining moment came when Stephen and Carol, both missing their mother, asked if they could spend the Christmas break with her. I had no objections, so they eagerly made arrangements to meet her. I asked Gail and Betty to accompany us, as I had a bad feeling about the situation. When we arrived at the usual meeting spot, the kids were excited, though Stephen was also expressing how much he would miss Betty. As time went on and their mother didn't show up, Stephen tried calling her without success. After 2 hours, they asked me to drive by her house, and I reluctantly agreed. When we arrived at a modest suburban house, Stella answered the door and spoke briefly with Stephen and Carol outside. Her body language and agitation made it clear that she hadn't intended to honor the visitation. She had hoped the kids would forget in the holiday rush and was unprepared for their visit. Carol ran back to the truck in tears, and Stephen returned slowly, his emotions visible. Betty comforted him as he broke down in silent tears. The drive back was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by Stephen's quiet reflection on the pain he had endured from previous visits when we hadn't shown up. His words hit hard. "This is how you felt every time you came, and we didn't show up." As we got home, I spoke to the kids, emphasizing that while I couldn't change the past, I wanted us to focus on the present and future. I expressed my wish for them to find happiness and to share that happiness as a family. We shared a group hug, which marked the beginning of our healing process. The following night was Stephen's and Betty's high school graduation. Gail, Carol, and I, along with my grandparents and the Lambert family, were there to support them. As Stephen and Betty walked to receive their diplomas, I felt immense pride. After the ceremony, while Betty and Stephen joined their classmates in celebration, I noticed Stella approaching Stephen, trying to capture a photo with him. Stephen, clearly unenthusiastic, slipped away. Stella's frustration with the out-of-focus photo seemed symbolic of her attempts to reclaim a part of her life that had slipped away. Ted, Stella's former partner, had faced his own downfall. His life was devastated by a relationship with a gold digger who drained him financially. Now struggling, he and Stella found themselves in difficult circumstances. Stella, once glamorous, was now facing the consequences of her actions, reflecting her ruined life in that blurry photograph. Gail playfully asked about the Thompsons' farm purchase we were considering. I suggested that running cattle there could work, but we'd need to address a few issues, like getting the right tags and dealing with the alligators in the lake. Gail, always quick with a creative idea, mentioned that we could use the alligator hides for gifts like boots and belts for her girlfriends, and the kids. She even demonstrated a few poses, adding a touch of humor to the discussion. Curious about Carol, I asked where she had gone. Gail explained that Carol was interested in Tommy Douglas and was spending time with him. Tommy was nervous about asking me for permission to take Carol on a date, and Gail advised me not to scare him off. I chuckled, realizing that my reputation for protecting my family might be making him anxious. As Gail turned out the light, I reflected on the different kinds of wealth one could have. Money and valuable commodities seemed insignificant compared to the fortune of having a loving family. I thought about Randy Meisner's lyrics and how they resonated with my life. The true value lay in having my loved ones close and secure. In the quiet of the night, Gail's whisper brought me back to the present. She suggested we enjoy each other's company once more. As we embraced, I felt a deep sense of contentment and gratitude for the life we had built together. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.